let's look at Galatians then this evening. And for many people, Galatians is compared to Romans. It's viewed by people as a sister epistle to the Epistle to the Romans, simply because of its subject matter, its overarching theme. And the overarching theme of Galatians, therefore, the same as Romans, is the gospel. The theme is the same, but the two epistles are very, very different. And you can quite quickly get a sense of the difference when you compare the two. So Romans is magisterial, it's calm, it's reflective. Romans is the result of 15 years or so of Paul reflecting on his experience of meeting Christ, his understanding of how Christ fulfills all that has gone before. Galatians, by contrast, is hot and angry and furious and passionate and very much a outpouring of Paul's frustrations, but also his determination to protect the gospel and to make sure that there is no other gospel, and that this is the gospel that all Christian people adhere to. So you get a very different Paul in Galatians to the one we meet in Romans, but the themes are the same. So the theme is the gospel, and what's true about Galatians is that Paul wants to think about the gospel in the light of the law. And by that he means the law of Moses. So what does the law do? How does the law sit in the context of the gospel of Christ? That's the idea of Galatians. So let's take a look at the structure. And you have an introduction in the first chapter, as you'd expect. Paul identifying himself, as he does in the first verse, and then telling us to whom the letter is addressed. So we have in verse 2 of chapter 1, to the churches of Galatia. And there's a great debate about who they are. And if you like, the debate falls into two areas. Are these Galatians what are known as the North Galatians, or are they the South Galatians? Are they Romanized areas around North Turkey, or are these Galatians early Celts, Gauls, if you like? So there's a huge debate around the audience to whom Paul writes. But we have the Galatians very clearly stated, and the first 10 verses of chapter 1 is the introduction. And Paul wastes absolutely no time in this introduction to get to the very heart of the issue. And the issue then is the gospel, and we see it in verse 6, and verses 6 to 10 form the substance of the epistle as a whole. So let's read verses 6 to 10, chapter 1. I marvel that you are turning away so soon from him who called you in the grace of Christ to a different gospel. Now, two words are important there. The word different means different in kind. It doesn't mean two of the same things. So there's one gospel, there's another gospel, they're very similar. It doesn't mean that at all. It means different by definition, the exact opposite of. And it's a very powerful word that you have in verse 6. And then, of course, you've got the word gospel, which, as we know, means good news. So Paul is presenting what's a contradiction in terms by these two words. There is no such thing as a different gospel. It's impossible to have a completely different good news to the one that Paul has been preaching. And as you look at verse 7, he then makes it clear it is not another gospel. And that's a sort of different word there. It's not another gospel, but there are some who trouble you. And as you go down those verses, just notice how often the word gospel occurs. It's in verse 6, it's in verse 7, it's in verse 8, it's in verse 9. He's really hammering home you with great passion that he is defending the gospel. And he does so by using a word that is the most powerful word in Paul's arsenal. And it's the word curse. And you see it in verse 8. If anyone else, even we ourselves, or an angel or anything, preaches another gospel, this word for different in kind, let him be accursed. And to use that word was shocking, and it was powerful. It meant that you wished the worst possible outcome for those who are preaching this other gospel that is not a gospel. And it's a word that is tied to the law. Now remember, this epistle is about the relationship of the gospel of Christ to the law. And so Paul begins by using a law word, curse, and it's a word that means anyone who does not keep the law is cursed. So Paul is playing on the idea there that these people who are preaching another gospel, they are themselves cursed, even though they wish to bring in the law to the gospel of Christ. And Paul repeats this, okay? So these 10 verses, particularly verses 6 to 10, are hugely important. Paul puts his cards on the table. He's not going to mess about. He's not going to be sensitive or gentle or persuasive. He's going to be none of these things. He's going to be vehement. He's going to be zealous. He's that Paul who identifies with Phineas in the Old Testament as a prophet of righteousness. That's your introduction. And then you get section 1. And section 1 of the gospel is from chapter 1, verse 11. And it extends down to the end of chapter 2. And that's verse 21. And that section is known as the truth of the gospel. So by that, he means the truths that the gospel brings. Truth with a capital T. What is the truth of the gospel? And Paul brings that truth in a context of conflict with Peter. And we know the story. It's a strange story of how Peter at one point was very happy to meet with Gentile Christians, to eat with Gentile Christians, to have a sort of equality with Gentile Christians. And then these troublemakers, they had arrived and they had persuaded Peter that it was sinful for a Jewish Christian and a Gentile Christian to be on equal terms. And these false teachers had said that Gentile Christians who must be separate also need to be circumcised. Now, Peter was influenced by that. And so Paul stands against him and he proclaims the truths of the gospel. And those truths are that we are justified by faith in Christ. It is the cross of Christ that is the basis for our rightness with God. Faith then brings that rightness to us, and it's apart from, separate to, unrelated to the law. And we've spent a number of weeks, haven't we, looking at Galatians 2 and verse 20. I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me, and the life which I now live. So it's a declaration that the gospel is rightness with God through faith in Jesus Christ. That's the first section. And then what you have from chapter 3 and verse 1, as far as chapter 5 and verse 15, is Paul then defending the gospel. And what we mean by the word defense is he's proving. So like a lawyer in court who wants to prove his case, Paul now sets out to prove the truths of the gospel. And he does so by thinking about Abraham and how Abraham was justified before the law came. So as you look at chapter 3 and verses, verses 6 and 7 and 8, he's going back to the time of Abraham. He's taking that verse that we've seen, that Abraham believes in God and it was accounted to him for righteousness. It's that same quote from Genesis that Paul includes in his letter to the Romans and in chapter 4. Abraham was right with God through faith. 400 years later, the law comes through Moses. So how can the law, therefore, be a way of justifying, be a basis on which we are right with God? The law came later, but Abraham was justified, righteous, prior to the law. So therefore, the law isn't about justifying people or making people right. The law has a different purpose. And Paul then works out what that purpose is. And he says the law, its purpose was to prove us to be sinners. The law's purpose is to show us that we cannot keep it. The law's purpose is to condemn and not save. So that when the law has done its work, and we know ourselves to be sinners, and we know ourselves to be saved, we need salvation, we are ready then for Christ and for the message that we are justified, made right by another, and that other is Jesus Christ. So the law prepares us by showing us our need, and then Christ is the answer to that need and the way by which we are right with God. So Paul defends, he works out, he proves the truth of the gospel. Okay, that's section 3. Then what he does in chapter 5, he does it in other epistles, he moves on to talk about the life of the gospel. How does the gospel work itself out in our lives? So from chapter 5 and verse 16 down to chapter 6 and verse 10, we have a working out of what you can describe as ethics, how to live. And we live by the power of the Spirit. We live the life of the Spirit. So here's Paul now echoing what he says in Romans 8, that it is through the influence and the life and the person of the Spirit of God that we are able to live a life that is pleasing to God. That's chapter 5. And then in chapter 6, verses 1 to 10, Paul is talking about how does the gospel impact on our relationships with each other? How do Christians get on with each other? And if we have time, we can say a little bit more about that later on. So that's section 4, the life of the gospel. And so what you've got left then is the conclusion. So chapter 6, verse 11 through to verse 18, Paul wraps everything up. And what he talks about here is the new creation idea. Now, Paul's repeating himself again. We have 2 Corinthians 5, if anyone is in Christ, he is a new creation, and we have that repeated here. Now, it's likely that Galatians was written first, so that what we have in Romans and what we have in Corinthians comes after Galatians. So these are the first occasions then for Paul to be telling us about a new creation, about Abraham being justified by faith, and so on. So take a look at the conclusion, Galatians 6 and verse 15. For in Christ Jesus, neither circumcision nor uncircumcision avails anything, but a new creation. So this is the new creation conclusion that Paul is testing out here in Galatians. And Paul is a gift to preachers because Paul repeats himself and he repeats himself and then he comes back and then he goes over. And that's the way we learn. We hear something, we need it repeated, we need to walk around in it a bit, we need space to think about it. And that's what Paul does in Galatians. He keeps repeating what the gospel is, what it means, how it is in Christ, and be careful of those bewitchers who will tell you otherwise. One other interesting thing to notice in the conclusion is verse 11. Galatians 6 and verse 11. Look, he says, with what large letters I have written to you in my own hand. Now, perhaps we can discuss this, because Paul would have dictated Galatians. Now, you imagine, Paul is speaking in a great passion of words. He's hot. He's filled with fury and righteous indignation. So he is dictating the letter. We're not sure who remember the word amanuensis? We don't know who that may be. But at this point, Paul takes the pen out of the hand of the scribe, and he pens a few words in his own handwriting. And what you see in verse 11 is that these letters, the bit that Paul writes, is in large letters. They are physically large, they're large print. So why do you think Paul needs to add something in his own hand? And why does he do it in such large print? Okay, perhaps that's something we can talk about later on. So that's the structure of Galatians then. And very quickly, let's look at some of the themes. And we've worked out the major theme. The major theme is the gospel and the relationship of the gospel to the law. And that's the law of Moses. And what Paul does in Galatians is he uses certain phrases. He keeps repeating certain phrases as he tries to make clear that the law has nothing to do and no part to play in the gospel. So he uses phrases like under the law. And you'll see that phrase several times in the course of the epistle. Let me just point out to you one or two of them. So chapter 3 and verse 23. But before faith came, we were kept under guard by the law, kept for the faith which would be afterwards revealed. Okay? It's under the law, under guard by the law. Okay? You see the same in chapter 4 and verse 4, talking about Jesus. When the fullness of time had come, God sent forth his son, born of a woman, born under the law. It's the same in verse 5, it's the same in verse 21, and it's the same in chapter 5 and verse 18. Now, what's this theme? You're under the law. And the main idea there is under gives the sense of being burdened. It's the sense of being oppressed. It's the weight and the heaviness of the law crushing down with all its demands and all its terrors, with its unyielding nature, with its no exceptions, with its absoluteness. You must keep it all. It's the law bearing down upon individuals who then find it to be a heavy burden, one that is hard to bear. And of course, the idea then is that Jesus himself, the Son of God, was born under the law, and that he put himself under that burden and lived under that burden of the law, but managed to keep the law himself. So that's the burdensome nature of the 10 Commandments. Paul will then use the phrase, the works of the law. If you look at chapter 2, and verse 16, and he says at the end there, by the works of the law, no flesh shall be justified. And that phrase, the works of the law, it means how the law works. So it's not we have to do the works of the law, it's the law works like this. The law operates in this way. So the law operates not to justify people, not to make people right with God. The law operates in the exact opposite way. It works to condemn. That's the works of the law. And then very cleverly, Paul will even talk about the law of Christ. So take a look at chapter 6 and verse 2. Bear with one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ. Now, he's been spending all this time telling us there is no law with the gospel. The gospel does not need the law. The law is a burden. The law is an imposter. If anybody brings back the law, then they are cursed, and then of course he uses the phrase the law of Christ. And he's doing it in a sense to capture our attention, but also to give us the idea that the law is the law of love. And you see that in chapter 5, verses 13 and 14. You see it there, the law of love. So it's not exactly a pun, but it's a play on words when he talks about the law of Christ. So that's the theme then. It's the law, how he describes it in various ways. And then he finishes off by talking about the law of Christ, the love that should capture the hearts of Christians. Another theme, I've mentioned it already, is Paul's confrontation with Peter. And the thing for then you to do, and we won't do it now, but we can do it on ourselves, is to figure out when this confrontation took place. What council is Paul referring to in Galatians, the one that took place at Jerusalem? Is it the one in Acts 11? Is it Acts 15? Is it an earlier council, a later council? There's a huge debate about when this great face-to-face confrontation took place between Peter and Paul. And as I say, we can think about that for ourselves. There's a verse in Galatians 2 that is increasingly causing a lot of debate. And I just want to point it out to you. It's a very interesting phrase in Galatians 2, and it's found in verse 16. So let's take a look at Galatians 2 and verse 16. I'll read the whole verse. Knowing that a man is not justified, and this is a summary of what he said to Peter. Knowing that a man is not justified by the works of the law, but by faith in Jesus Christ. Even we have believed in Christ Jesus, that we may be justified by faith in Christ, and not by the works of the law, but by the works of the law, no flesh is justified. Now, so far, so good. What's the interesting phrase there? Could you spot it? It's not very well translated in English. I'm just going to sort of tell you what the debate is and see what you make of it. So in verse 16, the phrase, but by faith in Jesus Christ, faith in Jesus Christ, in the Greek, that phrase can be translated like this: the faith of Jesus Christ. And the translation is possible, okay, I'm just saying that, it's possible to translate the phrase as the faith which Jesus Christ had. And if that is the correct way of translating that phrase, that Jesus Christ himself had faith, what the argument goes is that just as Jesus kept the law for us, just as Jesus bore the punishment for us, Jesus has also believed for us. He has also exercised faith for us. And the people who advocate this view tell us, now look, are you really going to say that Jesus has done everything for us apart from our faith? Even though our faith is a gift from God, isn't that still a bit that we are doing somehow? So there are those who say this verse clearly means Jesus has believed for us. He has exercised faith on our account. Just as he's done everything else, he has also believed for us. And when Paul then goes on in the verse to say that even we have believed in Jesus Christ, he's saying there that Jesus believed for us, he's exercised faith on our behalf, perfectly believing on our account, and we then, because he's perfectly believed, we can have the faith that God has given us so that that applies to us. Now, there's a big debate. Some very well-known preachers and commentators are starting to say that that's what the verse means. That the phrase in Greek is pistis, which is faith, to Christou, which is of, the faith of Jesus Christ. It's a subjective genitive. I can't think of my phrases now. Okay, so it's about Christ exercising faith. That's what some people think. Okay, very interesting verse. Can I just do a couple of more before we finish? In chapter 4, and in verses 4 and 5 and 6, you have what's called incarnation theology. If you take a look at chapter 4 and verse 4, but when the fullness of the time had come, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, born under the law. So here's God sending his Son to be incarnate, to be born, to take on flesh and blood, to take on human nature, and to live under the curse of the law. Then verse 6, chapter 4. And because you are sons, God sent forth the Spirit of his Son into your heart. Now, can you see in verse 6, sent forth is repeated. It's in verse 4, God sent forth his Son. Verse 6, God sent forth his Spirit. And so Paul is teaching us in the same way then, the same sense, as Christ was incarnate, he came and it was infleshed, the Spirit of God is infleshed. He becomes flesh by coming to dwell in our hearts. The Spirit of God is born in us in the same way as Christ is born into our world. There's a parallel incarnation. The Son comes into the world, the Spirit comes into the world, and the flesh of both is the flesh and blood of human beings. It's a wonderful parallel. And of course, what that then means, like in Romans, is because we have the Spirit, we can cry out, Abba, Father, like in Romans 8. Okay, let's think two more things then to look at. Chapter 3, let's see if I can find the verse. Chapter 3 and verse 28. Now, this is another verse that's receiving a huge amount of attention at the present time. And I wonder if you can work out why. Chapter 3, verse 28. There is neither Jew nor Greek. There is neither slave nor free. There is neither male nor female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. Now, did you notice my emphasis there to give you a clue? There is neither male nor female. And the debate, current debate is Paul saying that there's no such thing as males and females? That somehow Christ has come and abolished those distinctions in him. So just like there's no distinctions between Jew and Gentile or slave and free in him, so that in Christ there is no male or female either. There is in society, but in this new creation, these distinctions no longer apply. And the male and female distinction no longer applies. So its gender identity no longer applies in Christ. Well, that's what it says, but what does it mean? Okay. And then last of all, chapter 6, after all of Paul's hard work, after this great outpouring of passion, he then says something that is really weird. Chapter 6, and let's have a look if I can find the verse. Verse 16. So right at the end, okay? Verse 16. And as many as walk according to this rule, peace and mercy be upon them, and upon the Israel of God. What on earth is that? Why does he bring in the Israel of God? He's just demolished the law. He's just demolished the Mosaic covenant. He's just told us there's no Jew, there's no Greek, there's no slave, there's no free. He's just demolished everything. All those things are done away with in Christ. We have freedom in Christ, chapter 5. We have liberty in Christ. All the old demarcations have gone. And then he says, the Israel of God. Why does he do it? And what's really interesting is he uses a Jewish form of blessing, peace and mercy. you see it in verse 16. Peace and mercy be upon them. Now, usually an Israeli blessing would be mercy and peace. So he turns it around and then he refers to the Israel of God. What do we think then is going on there? So there's some of the themes of this epistle. There is the structure of the epistle. The theme overall is the gospel and the law of God.